Welcome to Nice and Blunt. These are my top 5 must-start wide receivers for Week 5. These players are normally in flex consideration, but I think this week you can trust the matchup, trust the situation, and you definitely want to start them in your lineup. Let's go. Okay, so obviously there are some players who are better starting options than these guys, but I don't want to give you obvious names. I'm only going to give you players who I rank around wide receiver 20 to 30, who are normally not immediate starts for you, but I think this week deserve that consideration. My number 1 must-start wide receiver this week is Marquise Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. I have him as my wide receiver 19 on Monday night at home versus the Indianapolis Colts. So here are his stats through 4 games. He gets 7 targets a game, which only ranks as wide receiver 36, 4.8 receptions per game, only ranks as wide receiver 33. However, he turns that into 81.5 yards per game, which is a top 10 number. It's 9th best among all wide receivers this season. And it's because of his amazingly high 17.2 yards per reception. That ranks 11th among all wide receivers in the NFL. And he's also been scoring touchdowns 3 through 4 games, and a touchdown rate of 0.75 per game is tied for 8th best in the league. So even though he's only catching less than 5 passes a game, he is turning them into a lot of fantasy points every time he gets the ball. An average of 15 half PPR points per game so far this season, and that ranks as wide receiver 12 through 4 weeks. I think his stats are pretty legit. And this week, I like the matchup. The Colts defense so far has been allowing only 217 passing yards per game, which isn't great. It's actually the 9th best passing defense in the league. However, 161 of those yards go to wide receivers, and we know that the target tree in Baltimore is very narrow. They're also giving up 15 yards per reception, which is one of the highest numbers in the league. And that means they are susceptible to deep passes, and we know that that's part of Marquise Brown's game with that high 17.2 yards per reception. But the key stat that makes Marquise Brown a must-start wide receiver for me is the fact that the Colts defense has allowed 8 touchdowns to wide receivers specifically through 4 games. So Hollywood Brown is averaging 80 yards a game on 5 catches, which means he has a 10-point floor every week. And with this matchup against the Colts, I think it is almost a guarantee that he scores a touchdown. The odds are definitely in favor that that happens on Monday night. And that's why I think he scores more than 15 fantasy points in half PPR. He is my wide receiver 19, a must start in Week 5. The next player I have as a must-start is Kenny Golladay, and I was going to make this video about Sterling Shepard. However, the news today is that he is out this weekend, and he is not fully recovered from that hamstring injury, but he was practicing on the side, not in pads, so he is trending in the right direction. I think next week Sterling Shepard will be back. But let's focus on Kenny Golladay, because with the news that Shepard is out once again, Kenny Golladay moves up to my wide receiver 20, going up against Dallas on the road on Sunday. I originally had him as my wide receiver 35 in my rankings video, but he vaults up those rankings. This season, Kenny Golladay is already getting 6 targets a game, and with Sterling Shepard out, there's 7 targets a game that become available. So I expect Kenny Golladay to get a big workload and for his volume to go up. He's already catching 4.3 receptions per game so far this season, but with more targets, that's likely to be more than 5 in this game. And he's averaged 70.4 receiving yards per game so far through the first month of the year. And that ranks as wide receiver 20. So there's a pretty solid floor when it comes to Kenny Golladay. However, he has yet to score a touchdown this season. However, in Week 4, when he took over as the number 1 last week, he was able to produce without scoring. He saw 7 targets and caught 6 receptions for 116 yards. But even though that was an overtime game, I would expect him to go over 100 yards again this week against Dallas. The Dallas Cowboys defense, despite catching 2 interceptions in every single game so far, is allowing 315 passing yards per game, which ranks 2nd worst in the NFL, 31st in the league. And 212 of those yards are specifically going to wide receivers every single game. On top of that, they've also given up 6 touchdowns through 4 games to wide receivers specifically. And I think this week, the number 1 wide receiver for the Giants is not only going to go over 100 yards, but also score. And that happens to be Kenny Golladay once again. So that's why I believe in Kenny Golladay this week. He's my wide receiver 20, and he is a must start in week 5. Another player who I'm really high on in week 5 is Marvin Jones of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 22, and he's going up against the Tennessee Titans at home, who have a very bad defense. But let's focus on Marvin Jones first. Through 4 games, he's getting 7.8 targets a game, which ranks as wide receiver 25. He's catching 5 receptions a game, ranks as wide receiver 27. Only turning it into 54.5 yards per game, which isn't great. That ranks 48th among all wide receivers, but he has caught 2 touchdowns so far, so he does have a role in the red zone, and without DJ Chark available anymore, I think his red zone targets will increase throughout this season. Through the first 4 games, he's averaging 11 half PPR points per game, and that ranks as wide receiver 30 on a per game basis. But this week, he has an amazing matchup. The Tennessee Titans defense is allowing 267 passing yards per game, which ranks 23rd in the NFL, so bottom 10. And against wide receivers specifically, they're giving up the majority of those yards, 236 yards per game to wide receivers. Yards per reception allowed of 15.5 per catch. So they're susceptible to the deep pass, and I think Marvin Jones is going to get some yards after the catch this week. But an even better stat that points to a big game for Marvin Jones is the fact that the Titans defense has given up 8 touchdowns through 4 games to wide receivers. So there's a chance at least 1 or 2 touchdowns are scored this week, and that's why I think you can feel very confident that Marvin Jones not only catches 5 or 6 passes, goes over 60 yards or so, but also scores a touchdown. I think he's one of the best flex options this week at the wide receiver position. I like Shenault as well. I think he has a good chance to score, but I only have him as my wide receiver 33. I think the touchdown is just more likely to go to Marvin Jones, and that's why Marvin Jones is the must-start play in Jacksonville for me. My wide receiver 22 overall in week 5. Another name I have inside the top 25 is Brandin Cooks, my wide receiver 24 versus New England. So through 4 games, Brandin Cooks has one of the highest floors among all wide receivers. He's seeing 9.8 targets a game. That ranks 10th among all wide receivers in the NFL. He's catching 7 receptions a game, which ranks tied for 6th with Keenan Allen and Deebo Samuel, and he's turning it into 92.3 yards per game, which ranks as wide receiver 5. So the numbers for Brandin Cooks are inside the top 10. He has a very high floor. He's only caught 1 touchdown so far. However, this only means that he is not touchdown dependent and should make you even more confident in starting Brandin Cooks. He's scored 14.2 half PPR points per game, which ranks as wide receiver 15. And like I said earlier, he is one of the highest floor plays that you can start at the wide receiver position in the NFL. I understand he plays on Houston, but his target share is first in the NFL. 35.1% of the Houston targets are going to Brandin Cooks, and no other wide receiver in the NFL can say that they have a target share that high. Based on these stats, if he were to score a touchdown, he is easily a top 15, if not top 10 wide receiver. However, this week, I'm just tempering expectations a little bit. That's why I only have him at number 24, and it's because of this matchup against the Patriots. The Patriots' defense strength is in the secondary. We saw them limit Tom Brady a little bit last week, held the Buccaneers to less than 20 points, and we know that they're going to shut down Davis Mills to a certain extent. So there's always a chance that Belichick is able to game plan his way into taking Brandin Cooks completely out of the game entirely, and I'm wrong about this ranking, but I'm willing to take the chance because you are not counting on a touchdown in order to produce. He's not touchdown dependent. So I do think the volume will be there for Brandin Cooks in week 5. The Patriots defense against wide receivers so far is only allowing 11.75 receptions per game. That's not very good. Less than 150 yards per game to wide receivers. Again, not very good. And only 2 touchdowns through 4 games. So there's definitely some risk involved. But even though I don't think he scores a touchdown, I think he still scores about a dozen points, if not more. And I basically consider Brandin Cooks unbenchable at this point in any type of PPR format. I think that he proves that to be true this week and finishes as a top 25 wide receiver. That's why I view him as a must start in week 5. And the last player I'm going to mention in this video is Corey Davis of the New York Jets, my wide receiver 26 this week, going on the road in this London game versus the Atlanta Falcons. Through the first 4 games of the season, Corey Davis is getting 7.3 targets per game, which ranks as wide receiver 32. He's catching 4 receptions a game, ranks as only wide receiver 44, but a pretty high yards per reception of 16.1, ranks 17th best in the league, is why he's able to turn those 4 catches into 64.3 yards per game, which ranks as wide receiver 30 in the NFL. So a pretty decent floor for Corey Davis. He's got 3 touchdowns through 4 games, so that high touchdown rate, 8th best in the league, is allowing him to produce for fantasy 12.9 half PPR points per game so far this season, and that ranks as wide receiver 19 in all of fantasy football for Corey Davis. So only 4 receptions a game is a little bit risky. However, this is a great matchup. The Falcons defense is allowing 264 passing yards per game. That ranks as the 21st worst defense, so bottom 12 in the league. And against wide receivers specifically, 170 yards given up per game and 7 touchdowns through 4 games. So Corey Davis is the touchdown scorer for the New York Jets wide receivers, and I think the odds are in his favor that he scores another touchdown. Last week I had Davis as my wide receiver 21, and he definitely paid off with that 53-yard touchdown. He racked up 111 yards on 4 receptions last week. And against Atlanta, I do believe that he scores a touchdown again and merits a high ranking. However, I'm not convinced that he goes over 100 yards in this one. He's paid the most, and he is the team captain. So I believe that he's going to finish as a top 30 option in week 5. He is a must-start wide receiver for me, my wide receiver 26 in week 5. So it's going to wrap up my top 5 must-start wide receivers this week. If there's a player you have a question about, go ahead and leave me a comment down below, or head to my Instagram page where you can find all of my rankings. As always, this advice is intended for half PPR leagues, so adjust a little bit based on your scoring format. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. I appreciate the support. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.